All right. So this should be now posting live. I'll see that if it's actually, well, hopefully it's going to broadcast to YouTube. I'm not seeing it quite yet, but for those watching on, okay, there we go. So I apologize for that soft start, but this is my first experience using StreamYards. And I had to, because usually when I live stream, I'm live streaming by myself. But today I have on Professor Matt McManus, I think is how do you pronounce it? And
yeah,
we are
McManus.
discussing, go ahead. We were discussing his book, Postmodern Conservatives, but perhaps you could, how do you pronounce your name again? I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. My name is Matthew McManus, and my book is, well, there's two of them. There's The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism, and then there's an essay collection, What is Postmodern Conservatism, which also includes a few contributions from other people like Warner Radnick, David Hollins, Conrad Hamilton, and so on.
Okay, so I read one of them. Now that I think about it, I think I might have read the essay collection.
Okay.
But we are here, I guess, discussing both books. So as I had planned it, I was going to just take 20 minutes to broadly allow you to lay out your thesis and for me to ask clarifying points. And then after 20 minutes, I guess at around 6:15, we'd go into more of a dialectic mode. So I guess just to kick it off, how would you describe postmodern conservatism, or how do you describe it in your books on postmodern conservatism?
Sure. Well, the explanation is pretty simple, right? I mean, postmodern conservatism is the kind of conservatism or the kind of reactionary politics that one would expect to see in a postmodern culture. And a lot of the book is actually taken up not by discussing conservatism, but it actually constitutes postmodern culture, why it emerged, how it emerged, and whether or not we can overcome its limitations. But the argument that I make is that obviously, there are postmodern variants of left-wing politics, and this has been well known for some time, and there are plenty of people on the political right who've criticized it. I have mixed feelings about some of these different movements, but it was one-dimensional to think that postmodern cultures wouldn't eventually generate a conservative counterpart to the kind of postmodern movements we see on the left.
Yes, I mean, it's funny hearing about this. You know, as sort of a longtime member of the distant right, it's funny hearing about the phenomenon described from the other end, because I think that conservative, well, see, I wouldn't even describe myself as a conservative. I would describe myself as a right winger. But not to go too much on my own thing, I guess, what are your main observations about postmodern conservatism, your main arguments? I know that, you know, reading at least the essay collection, which I'm not so sure is sort of the main document, but reading the essay collection, I noticed a lot of people that I'm familiar with come up, including Patrick Deneen and Jordan Peterson. They get mentioned a lot, but maybe you could provide some examples and expand on that thesis?
Sure. Well, I actually don't consider Jordan Peterson or Patrick Deneen necessarily to be postmodern conservatives. I kind of talk about them and their broader contributions to the discourse around postmodernity. Since, as is well known, Peterson has lots to say about postmodern neo-Marxism. But one of the things that I point out is that if you look at certain strands of conservative thought and history, many of them were amenable to mutation under the conditions of postmodernity. And that's because they share a lot in common with the various features of postmodern culture. And I talk about people, particularly in the big book, like Edmund Burke, who famously was critical of Enlightenment rationalism and the idea that universalistic reason can give us all the answers in life. And instead, he appealed to the prejudices of the people and the little battalions that tended to make up society. And nowadays, we tend to associate this with a conservative ideology, sometimes called traditionalism or Burkean traditionalism. And then there are other people like Joseph de Maistre, who is even more reactionary and critical of Enlightenment reason, describing it oftentimes in the most emphatic terms as tantamount to a cancer or some kind of Luciferian rejection of authority. And he points out that if you allow people to use their reason to scrutinize the world, and in particular to scrutinize politics, they're not going to have the kind of respect for authority that's needed to hold society together. So it's far more important for people to be deferential to the way we've thought about things and the way we've done things before in order to hold everything together than to allow people to question it all that much. And one of the things that I point out again is that you look down the line, and there are many different figures who make such arguments. It shouldn't become as much a surprise that you're now going to have postmodern figures who are drawing on this tradition in a postmodern culture to make arguments like liberal elites, scientific worldviews, these should be rejected. What we need is a restoration of tradition, religion, civilizational attachments, and so on.
So it's funny. I mean, I'm quite widely read on Joseph de Maistre. He's one of my primary influences.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, and I guess perhaps I'm jumping the gun on just turning this into a dialectic, but I see Joseph de Maistre, well, the idea of reason is much more nuanced than the description that it's just that reason bad, authority good. I think that oftentimes that's a little crude description of his beliefs, but I think that the tradition that he kicked off, along with a lot of other thinkers in the early 20th century, was a primary right-wing tradition, or not tradition, school of thought. The problem was that it was necessarily radical, and after World War II, right-wing radicalism was essentially eradicated, and what we got was essentially gelded neoliberalism with some right-wing concepts slapped on top of it, which was a Buckleyite conservatism, and that's been dominant until really very recently. And so what you see, I think, recently is a resurgence or opening up of the idea space to an incredibly broad range of different ideas that have been neglected. And when I see Joseph de Maistre, I see someone who prefigured postmodernism. He was postmodern before postmodernism existed. And it took such a long time for thinkers on the left to really look at their own modernistic analytics of society and go, look, guys, this is bullshit. This isn't actually describing what reality is like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say all the figures that I point out in the book, I'm not trying to reductively imply that they were postmodern conservatives prior to the emergence of people like Donald Trump and so on, because each of them is more complex if you look at the nuances of their thinking. So for instance, when it comes to Joseph de Maistre, one of the things I point out in the big book is that his St. Petersburg dialogues are tonally and philosophically different than what you see sometimes in the works that are most directly about the French Revolution, would tend to have a bit more of a shrill tone to them, probably because there's world historical events going on. But when it comes to like this lack of reflection about the condition of postmodernity and its association with neoliberalism, that's something that I talk about quite extensively, because one of the things that characterizes neoliberal societies and what makes them distinctively postmodern, in my interpretation at least, is that particularly starting in 1989, there was this insistence that neoliberal societies had entered an end of history phase. This is Francis Fukuyama's famous thesis, and Fukuyama's book is actually a lot more complicated than people give it credit for. But the general idea was that history is at an end, and in those kind of contexts, it wasn't necessary for people to commit themselves to grand universal theories anymore because they weren't required to reflect on them. What they were supposed to focus on was the gratification of their own particular desires as competitive actors in an increasingly stratified market society. And this is one of the conditions that I talk about, which was important for the generation of postmodern culture. Since, of course, when you see yourself as a kind of non-historical actor who's just about there trying to satisfy your individual desires, it's very possible that you're going to develop a highly relativistic vision of what the world is about. Since you're not trying to figure out what kind of grand ideology should I commit myself to that other people would think is important or that would be vital for other people to live the good life. You're just sitting there thinking about what are my needs and how can I pursue them most effectively, regardless of what anyone else might think.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was a long-standing tradition of right-wingers pushing back against the Fukuyama types in the 90s, although most of those were very minor Buchanites that mostly got ignored. Yeah. Although I will say this, it's sort of funny because I was reading, I guess it was
American Heritage Foundation people.
Oh, pardon me?
No, I was going to say neoconservatives in particular. It's something I'm discussing in my new book, who did push against the Fukuyama thesis a little bit.
Well, I mean, that's strange because in my circles, Fukuyama's thesis is associated with neoconservatives. But I was just going to say, one text that comes up a lot in at least your essays is Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher, which is, I really like that book. But just to put sort of and another one, two things that also come up are Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue and Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. I talked to Patrick Deneen about a year ago, I think, and
lucky you, he's a really smart guy.
He's a really smart guy. I like him, and I really liked his book at least. And he, we were talking about Alan Bloom, which is the obvious, the Closing of the American Mind, which is an obvious predecessor for Why Liberalism Failed. And when I was in college, I read Closing of the American Mind, and I gave it to some of my progressive classmates, and they got caught on the chapter where he was discussing about the inuring effect of modern and popular music. But then it was so strange to me is when I picked up Fisher's Capitalist Realism, he complains about the exact same thing. He almost echoes Alan Bloom and says things like, my students are addicted to their music, and it's not so much an ethereal experience of transcendence, it's more just a security blanket, and they're not curious about other forms of music. It was so funny because I felt that the overlap between Capitalist Realism and those other authors that you mentioned in your works on postmodern conservatism were incredible. They're almost talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I know. I would absolutely agree with you. And I think, again, when you get into the highest qualitative pitch of thinkers, I don't really think it matters whether or not you're on the left or the right, because oftentimes people reach the same conclusions because they're probing very deeply into the problems that face us, right? And I think that's true if you look at somebody like Fisher. And I'd say I think it's true also if you look at someone like Patrick Deneen. When it comes to somebody like Alan Bloom, I think he did open up the door by talking about a very distinctive kind of elite attitude that one sees in postmodern cultures, particularly at expensive universities. So one of the things that always struck me when reading The Closing of the American Mind is how he was talking about how there's a difference between being a Socratic skeptic and being a kind of easy nihilist. And he says, a Socratic skeptic does believe that there's some theory of the good or truth out there. They're not sure how we can get to it, but they're committed to the idea that we have to pursue it almost at all costs as the highest aspiration in life. Whereas the kind of easy nihilism that he saw, particularly reflected in pop music and the way these kind of college students approach the world, was basically just, they didn't care very much to pursue any kind of vision of the good life or truth. They just kind of were satisfied with the idea that each person had their own kind of mojo, and you follow through with that, right? Where I think
absolutely,
where I think Bloom went wrong, where I think Fisher and Deneen are more observant, and of course they have the benefit of 30 years of hindsight as well, is the impact that capital plays in generating the conditions for postmodern culture and for this kind of easy nihilistic attitude. And you see this in Deneen's book, where he talks, for instance, about how it is that people have become increasingly dissociated from politics because they don't feel like they can make an impact. Which means, of course, they become indifferent to what's going on in the world around them, while at the same time becoming isolated from others. And you, of course, see that in Fisher's work as well, when he talks exactly about what I was describing, the sense that we've reached the end of history, where it's not up to you to start thinking about how society should be organized. The important thing in your life is figuring out what kind of toaster oven you want to buy, or whether you can afford a big screen TV, or whether you're going to invest in a vacation instead. And, of course, Deneen and Fisher come to different conclusions about what the solution should be. To the extent you can even talk about Deneen talking about solutions at all. And I naturally tend to favor Fisher's approach a little bit more. But I think both of them have really prescient and interesting things to say about the time we live on that build on.
It's been a while since I've read Capitalist Realism. I don't remember solutions being a large part of that book. I seem to vaguely remember him mentioning something at the end.
It comes across more, not particularly in that book, but certainly his other writings. For instance, Exiting the Vampire Castle, which is a very influential essay he published, talking about some bad strains of leftism that he thinks need to be overcome. Talking about cosmopolitan socialism as it's called now. So I think if you look past the book, you see a little bit more of his constructive vision for what the better society would look like come through.
Again, A Vampire's Castle was something I read a long time ago and don't really have the best recollection of. But that was essentially about what you talk a lot about in your essays, which is identity politics. Now, I kind of wanted to talk to you about this because in my circles of the distant right, well, not just me, but a lot of people have a saying, and we say, well, all politics is identity politics. All politics is identity politics when it really comes down to it. And I think some people on the left would say that, but I got the sense that there was perhaps pushback from people like Fisher, perhaps people like you. What is your feelings on identity politics, and how do they play into this whole idea?
Well, I think that there's inevitably some truth, as there are to all platitudes, to the idea that all politics is identity politics. And I think you could even push this to a very dark extent by looking at someone like Carl Schmitt, when he said that all politics is predicated on the friend-enemy distinction, right?
Yes.
That's unpleasant, but there's some truth to it, right? You can't really get anything done in politics.
And Schmitt would be another huge influence on the dissident right.
Yeah. Now, where I push back on the idea that all politics is identity politics is the notion that what we should be aiming for is essentially a zero-sum situation where we have our ideology, they have theirs, and the goal should be for us to advance our ideology at the expense of them advancing theirs, and eventually to establish the kind of society we want in as uniform and homogenous a sense possible. And that's because I'm committed to a cosmopolitan socialist and ultimately liberal socialist outlook, where there should be room for difference and disagreement in society, deliberation on the best kinds of political forms that we want going forward. And so to the extent it is possible to overcome differences in political orientation predicated on identity, particularly predicated on something as stark as the friend-enemy distinction, I think we should be moving towards that, which is partly why I agreed to be on this show. Right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that the friend-enemy distinction, like most elements of right-wing politics, this is a descriptive, not a prescriptive element of the politic. I think if right-wingers would say, okay, cosmopolitanism is fundamentally the enemy of diversity.
Absolutely, but where I push back against this, drawing on people like Theodore Adorno, is it's really important to understand that there's always a naturalization that goes on whenever we try to just describe politics, and this has moral consequences, right? Like it'd be one thing, and if you were to say, we live in a world right now where politics tends to be about identity and tends to be predicated on the friend-enemy description. If all you're doing is describing the world, I would agree with you, right? And in fact, I would say that's a bad thing. What I think we have to do is resist the temptation to say that politics must be like this, and that this is a description that's true for all time. Because I don't think it needs to be like this. I think that there are ways that we can improve the situation, and we should resist the temptation to naturalize what's ultimately a very unfortunate and stultifying status quo.
Well, I mean, this is. I think it's sort of where we get into the idea of realism versus. This is where I think most right-wingers would say that this is not a real understanding of how politics works. The problems, as I see it right now, are or as many right-wingers would see it, is that progressive politics has essentially accumulated an enormous amount of hegemony in the culture, as Gramsci would describe it. But they don't even ever seem to really realize the trade-offs involved in cultural hegemony. They don't seem to understand that their application of cultural hegemony has consequences. And as such, we end up in this really, really weird situation. A lot of people in the right wing, we also have a joke. Every YouTuber in BreadTube, they all have a video about how right-wingers complaining about PC culture. We're all just making it up. It's all in our own minds. We're just, we're just big crybabies, and we should really grow a pair and, face the facts that people just want to be treated politely. And then, without exception, every single BreadTuber has crossed a line and has gotten "quote unquote" canceled. The greatest example of this is ContraPoints. They've spent the better half of, at least the better half of what's occurred in 2020 already, complaining of their own cancellation. Yet in 2017, they were telling us that all of these complaints about PC culture were just, figments of right-wing imagination. So it just, there never seems to become like this to terms with, what's actually happened in the culture, how rules and regulations work, and the trade-offs that are there. And as such, it's very, very difficult to have honest conversations about these things, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean, to a certain extent, I can empathize with that, right? although empathize with it while still being critical of it. So full disclosure, I've written pieces on what I sometimes call the right-wing outrage machine and its propensity to take really kind of mundane or idle acts by various progressive actors and magnify them into this huge cultural threat, often, for money or for attention. And I think people like Ben Shapiro or Dave Rubin, Dinesh D'Souza have made very lucrative careers off of that. And I also think it's a problem for the kind of deliberative politics that I'm talking about, because when you take these little incidental actions by various different left-wingers and you magnify them into a very serious problem, what you get when you try to engage with conservatives from a thoughtful leftist perspective is just kind of curt dismissal or immediate suspicion, right? Now, saying that, I do think that the left has some responsibility for establishing, a kind of PC culture, as it's sometimes called, and that's something that I want to see stop. And this is actually one of the reasons I find Fisher's essay on the Vampire Castle to be very resonant. I mean, one of the things that he points out in that essay is there's a certain kind of left-wing Twitter activist who has what he calls a priest desire to excommunicate, a academic pedant's desire to call out mistakes as quickly as possible, and hipster's desire to be part of the in-group. In this case, the in-group that's condemning whatever happens to be out of fashion at the moment. And I think actually that there are a few things that have held the left back from achieving real political success rather than just a level of cultural influence in recent years. And I would really like to see us move towards a more funny, engaged, thoughtful kind of leftist perspective. And I think a number of people are doing that quite successfully. You mentioned a few of them. I think ContraPoints is doing really good work on that. I think Ben Burgess has a new book that's coming out. I know you've interviewed him before. Has a new book that's coming about that. Michael Brooks. And then there are other people I could go on listening.
Well, I mean, from the right wing point of view, and this is the thing, the right wing has. I've said this before. To the right wing, the left wing seems, without additional theory, it seems like what they're doing is insane. But if you actually read people like Mencius Mollbug, and if you read people who talk about how power and inside organizations works, especially some of the more recent people on the distant right, like Spandrel, this whole cancel culture thing, this isn't a feature, this is a bug. This is how leftist revolutions always work. The left always eats itself. It's been happening for hundreds upon hundreds of years. It's not a feature specific to certain leaders or not specific to others. It's how the actual mechanism works. And I feel like leftists are constantly surprised about why this is happening. But I feel if they understood, I feel a lot of leftists have, they basically swallow the propaganda about their own political ideology more than an honest analysis of how their political ideology actually works. If you looked at history, you would expect cancel culture to emerge from a left-wing movement. It always happens.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that I agree with that, right? I mean, part of it depends on what you characterize as a left-wing or progressive movement through history, right? I mean, certainly that you can talk about the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or Maoism, right, as totalitarian leftist movements. And I would agree with that, and I would condemn them emphatically, right? The kind of leftism that I would endorse would actually be something like the social democratic movements that emerged in Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War, particularly something like Willy Brandt's socialism. And in these kinds of
social democracy, right? That's not socialism.
Well, yeah, social democracy, or what I call sometimes liberal socialism. We can get into it.
To me, that seems like neoliberalism, right? I mean, like the European Union is a chief facet of neoliberalism as it exists right now.
Absolutely, and we can certainly criticize it for that. And I think in many senses, the project has gone off course. But again, we'll talk about that in a few minutes if you want. But
go ahead. Continue your thesis.
Yeah, my kind of argument would be that what you saw with the social democracies in the Great Society period certainly wasn't an effort to clamp down on different ideological standpoints. If anything, what you saw was a restoration of democracy in many parts of the world where it had disappeared for decades under the auspices of totalitarianism. And there was a real effort to promote not just human flourishing, but a wide variety of different ideological standpoints, which is what you saw ultimately emerge, particularly starting in the 1960s. So I would completely agree with you that there are strands of leftism that can become reactionary and totalitarian and try to silence opposition. But I would also make the same claim about the political right. The kind of leftism that I'd like to endorse, liberal cosmopolitan socialism, has a long history of promoting democracy and promoting the rights of those who disagree with us, and taking those as central pieces of our political doctrine.
Well, yeah, I mean, this gets back to what these radical leftist projects actually are, and this is, I understand that leftists think of themselves not as a particular political movement, but simply as the sum total of all attempts to advance human well-being. But I just, as a sociologist, I think you can, if you are an alien looking at, say, Marxism in the 20th century, you would not see a movement that was prominently concerned with workers' rights. You would see a particular ideological movement that had very, very, it would work with workers' rights when it helped the ideology, and then would crush workers' rights when it didn't help the ideology. And so if you were just a scientist looking at it sociologically, you couldn't say like, oh, well, communism is about workers' rights, because it only helps workers' rights when it helps communism. And communism is just there to, well, basically improve the power of the communists who are in charge of it, at least how it works in practice. And a good example, it doesn't just stop with the communist party as we know it in the Eastern Bloc countries. If you look, for instance, this is sort of a talking point of the distant right or the postmodern conservatives. Again, I don't consider myself conservative, but let's just take two things, like mass immigration, or three things: mass immigration, drug culture, and the sexual revolution. These three things have been unmitigated disasters for the working class worldwide. Yet to an epsilon of error, almost all radical Marxists have supported them in one form or the other. And they destroyed, collectively, and they weren't the only effects that destroyed the working class community. Globalization and liberalism also played a part, but they did a huge number, and they are a huge part of the story about why the working class is crushed worldwide.
Well, I would diagnose that in a very different way than you do, but there's several parts to your question, or your comment, I should say, and so I'll break it down into several pieces, right? So on the question of Marxism, right, I think that if you look at any kind of doctrine and you judge it by its worst propagators, everything would look pretty bad, right? I mean, take something like Lockean capitalism, right? I mean, there are many people on the political right who admire, Locke, think that Locke played a foundational role in the establishment of American culture and civilization and his work ethic. Locke supported the slave trade. He supported the appropriation of indigenous land. The imperial projects that were carried out in his name cost the lives of millions of people across the globe. You can't really get accurate numbers on all of this because so much of it is heavily dated, right? But that's not exactly...
and Marx criticized a certain group of people that if I mention them, we'll get this stream taken down.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so if you judge him by that legacy, obviously Locke looks pretty bad. I don't think we should judge Locke by that legacy. I think that we should take the elements of Lockeanism that seem progressive and interesting and relevant to our time and put those to work in useful ways. And I would say the same thing about Marx, right? Marx had a lot of very interesting things to say about, for instance, the role that capitalism plays in producing things like postmodern societies. So one of the things that I always point back to is his comment with Engels in the Communist Manifesto, where he says, capital is upending traditions all across the globe, and everything that is solid is melting into the air, including everything that was once considered sacred and is now becoming profane. I mean, that is a prophetic observation to make in the 19th century about what at this point was just a very idiosyncratic way of organizing the economy emerging in Northern and Central Europe, right?
So you define, just so we can clear, when you say capitalism, you mean the specific form of industrial corporatism that emerged in the early 19th century?
I wouldn't necessarily say industrial corporatism. I would describe it more as a social form that gradually extended beyond the nation state through a variety of different processes and now encompasses much of the globe in a neoliberal variant. But kind of moving onwards, right? I mean, when it comes to something like Marxist totalitarianism, I think that's actually a really contentious question, right? I mean, Marx made some really, quite frankly, foolish statements about things like dictatorships of the proletariat that have been used as a justification for mass atrocities across the globe. We should condemn him for that, much like we should condemn Locke for making foolish statements about indigenous peoples But the point isn't to sit there and primarily to talk about what's not important or not interesting in Marx, or dated or dangerous in Marx, but what's useful about his work. And you could say the same thing about any other major thinker that I can think of in the Western canon, right? Imagine all the kind of arguments about Plato and Plato's association with totalitarianism, or from Plato to NATO, and so on, right? So that's the first kind of comment I'll make about that. Your second kind of comment was, I believe, about how the sexual revolution and a more permissive attitude and culture around drugs has been a disaster for the working classes.
Yeah, along with mass immigration. Yeah, you can visually see it. The working class carried its capital transmission through families. Okay. So when families were destroyed, they lost their ability to transmit capital in between generations. And the working class essentially moved from a saving and investment mode to a pure consumption mode at the same time where they lost their ability to hold down jobs.
Well, one of the things that I push back on at this point is the idea that we're in some kind of ahistorical juncture here where all these things are relatively new. I mean, if you look at the Victorian period, when Marx, for example, was writing, there were more prostitutes in London than in any other time in its history. And he describes in very vivid detail how it is that people turned to opium and drugs and alcohol as a way of dealing with the very serious exploitation that was going on, particularly in the lowest echelons of society, right? And if you look at even the 19th century, again, all of this was well known, right? Sherlock Holmes used cocaine. There were wars waged on behalf of the British Empire to try to open China and a market of 300 million people to opium products.
Oh yeah, I mean, but we understand that the opium destroyed China, right? Yeah. We weren't like, oh well, that's just a great idea. They'll have a good time with it. It's a personal decision.
Yeah, exactly.
We understood that opium literally destroyed China, right? Like this wasn't okay.
Yeah, for decades, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that if we have to be very cautious here when talking about us as being in some kind of historically novel period, right? I mean, these have been problems for a very long time. Where I think the sexual and the drug liberalization has actually benefited people is by not making criminals out of individuals who are going to engage in certain actions that most human beings seem predisposed to engage in, regardless of whether or not there are laws surrounding them. And I can point to my own experience having lived in Mexico for a long time. Right, the war on drugs has had a catastrophic effect on many of the poorest people, particularly in the north of the country, compounded by illegal gun smuggling from the United States.
Sure.
To mass violence, 10,000 deaths every year, billions of dollars lost in corruption. A lot of that can go away with more liberal drug policies.
Community.
Sorry?
I'm not a fan of the war on drugs. I'm saying drug use destroyed the working class community.
Yeah, fair enough. And I mean, that's a different.
Opium use destroyed. I mean, opium use wouldn't have not destroyed the Chinese Empire if they had made it legal and cooperated with it.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And I mean, when we look at kind of the use of narcotics, I think we have to ask ourselves why it is that so many people are turning to them in droves as a way of dealing with their problems, right? And I think, again, this is something I don't really discuss at length in the book because it's beyond my area of expertise. I mean, I'm not an expert in narcotics in any way, shape, or form, right? But people have often talked about, going back to Rick Roderick, how it is that Marx described religion as the opiate of the masses in the 1840s. Exploited, overworked, hopeless masses, right? And I don't think that's true anymore. I think Rick Roderick is right, and opium is now the opium of the masses, right? Some of these are legal and some of these are not, but people need to turn to these things as a way of dealing with their sense of enemy, and they don't have any kind of historical role to play.
But I guess my question was, I mean, the strange thing is that drug use destroyed the working class. High sexual permissive culture destroyed the working class. Large numbers of immigrants tanking the price of labor hurt the working class. All three of those things are largely supported by modern radical leftists. And while they were introduced to I don't remember any Marxists going like, I'm in a sexual revolution. We've got to fight against this. That was all right-wingers.
I don't necessarily think that all those things are supported by the left in the way that you're describing, right? I mean, when it comes to something like drug use, right? There are certainly figures that I can think of who endorse drug use as a kind of psychedelic way, getting in touch with yourself or forming more meaningful relations with other people. A lot of this stuff was popular in the 1960s, but it was also widely condemned by figures like Deleuze or Marcuse, who said that this is a substitute for, rather than a supplement to, something like real revolution. The kind of argument that a lot of these people were making was more or less the one that I was making, which is that criminalizing these kinds of activities is having a negative impact they should be permitted, not necessarily endorsed as part of the good life.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I feel that, I mean, if we perhaps take a little bit of a more fine example, the sexual revolution would be a great example. Now, I mean, in this case, Marxists attacking the family is almost a cliche. It started with Engels. It continued throughout the 20th century. So the destruction of sexual norms that guarded the family, largely those trends in sexual behavior were supported by the far left. I've never seen a socially conservative Marxist. I mean, I guess there might be.
I know one or two. You might be surprised.
Yeah, okay, one or two. Okay. They come from like China or Russia usually.
Yeah.
But I mean, like let's look at the broad statistical category of Marxists. This is, and I guess this is what sort of I'm kind of trying to get at here is, of course, there are exceptions, right? There are always exceptions, but the general behavior of these groups does not, I don't know, it doesn't seem to align with this whole idea of defending the interests of the working class at all costs. It seems to be, well, does this thing actually increase the power of the left? And even though I think, the sexual revolution, it massively hurt the working class, it benefited the power of the academic left and the far left. So
well, I think if you look at somebody like Marx,
for that reason,
it's easy to see where, I think that history is a little bit skewed, right? I mean, one of the things that Marx talks about relentlessly, particularly through the first volumes of Capital, and other socialist activists through the 19th century made the same point, is precisely how it is that unequal conditions, particularly exploitative unequal conditions, are leading to the destruction of the nuclear family. And Marx himself was a family man. He had an affair, which isn't something that I necessarily endorse, but he was married and had children. And he talks about how it is that kids are being ripped away from their families and sent to work in the dark satanic mills of 19th century England, or families are having to throw their children or themselves into jail in order to pay off their debts, and that this is wrong. And he even brings in a little bit of material. I think most Christians would agree
with that, right?
Yeah, sorry?
I think most right-wingers would agree with those things being bad.
Yeah, and I mean, Engels is a little bit more radical, but one of the points that he makes that I think is also pretty important for our purposes today is the fact that many women in 19th century England are forced to essentially work two jobs, and neither of them is particularly lucrative. And the fact that they don't have a great deal of money and a great deal of economic opportunity is one of the major things that impels them to go into something like the sex industry, for example. And he has long ruminations about why it is that women turn to prostitution. It's not because they particularly want to be there. It's usually because they're like, well,
again, universally, I mean, people in the 19th century would universally consider that a bad thing.
Yeah, and I should point out that
Engels wasn't tapping people on the shoulder and going, "Hey, did you know it's a bad thing that women are forced into a life of prostitution?" And that was not an ideological revelation.
No,
the idea that the family was oppressive and that religion was oppressive was an ideological revelation.
Well, I don't even know that Marx would necessarily say that religion was oppressive, right? I mean, sometimes Engels certainly would. I'll give you that. But one of the points that were made by this, the dialectical tradition certainly, was that religion actually plays an extremely important role in giving people a sense of meaning in a world that's fundamentally bad. And the point that they were trying to make isn't that religion is necessarily a bad force. In fact, it's a necessary one. It's that rather than just focusing on transcendent sources of meaning that may or may not exist, what we need to be trying to do is change the world so that people don't need to hypothesize about a future existence while they'll be happy. They can be happy in the life they're living right now. As equals, we're able to develop all sides of their nature and all that kind of stuff, right? But when it comes to the issue of like women's status, I think that you see this kind of idea continue. I mean, take up a Marxist feminist like Catherine McKinnon, right? Catherine McKinnon actually was oddly enough broadly embraced by many right-wingers for her stance against pornography and prostitution. And one of the things that she points out,
she was very prophetic about that.
Yeah, she was. And one of the things that she points out, I'm a pro-sex feminist, so I don't agree with a lot of what she's saying, right? I'm just using this as a kind of counterexample. Is that what people, the Reaganites of her day, aren't talking about is why is it that women go into prostitution and why is it that women turn to pornography to make money? It's because a lot of them don't have a lot of economic security. And so they're forced into these kinds of industries. And so one of the things she's going to say is if you want your Reaganite kind of family to exist, you might actually have to reinstate something like the welfare state.
But is that true, though? I mean, is that true? I mean, I know that in some circumstances, women are forced into prostitution due to economics. And I, as a right winger who believes in social justice, I absolutely want to fight that. But I mean, you might have been aware of this whole thing with Steven Spielberg's adopted daughter starting her career as a pornographer. And you just in the news this last day, there's this huge explosion of OnlyFans accounts started by affluent bourgeoisie 20-something college girls. These people aren't desperate.
Well, I mean, it really depends on what you mean by desperate, right? I mean,
historically, compared to anyone in the history of ever, bourgeoisie white women in their 20s going to college are not desperate by any reasonable standard of desperation that's ever been used in the history of humankind.
Well, you might feel differently if you lived in like 2020 and you thought to yourself, like, well, I'm probably not going to have a job because there's another recession and it's the second one in 10 years. And my college degree is going to saddle me with $60,000 or $80,000 worth of debt. And I'm never going to be able to pay that back since, it's probably going to increase and my salary is going to decline over time. And these are all a lot of responsibilities that people have to deal with that, sure, don't constitute something like indentured servitude on a white slaver's plant. But
I guess I don't think that that's the driver. I mean,
I'll give you an example, right? For example, or like of a recent documentary I saw about why it is that girls enter into the pornography industry, particularly in Florida, right? Almost all of them came from working class backgrounds. They invariably came from families with extremely little money, and these people offer them typically up to $2,000, $3,000 a month in order to go film 1 or 2 movies, right? If your option is sitting there being a waitress and earning less than minimum wage because you're just earning tips, or you're 18 years old and somebody's offering you $3,000, it doesn't really seem like a hard choice, right? Now, does that mean that the economic system is exclusively responsible for this? I would say no. I mean, we also have all kinds of patriarchal expectations about women's sexuality that facilitate and encourage people to generate these kinds of industries. But that's a whole other side. I think the economic one is also very important.
I guess, I mean, first of all, let's perhaps take this in a more constructive direction. If you acknowledge that this is so exploitative on the working class, then why would you disagree with the McKinnon position that pornography is horrible and exploitive, given what we know about it psychologically and also how it's produced?
I think a lot of it is, right? I don't disagree with it. What I think is a problem is how it is that the state or society should approach it, right? And because I'm a liberal socialist, I believe that ultimately people have rights to expression. And that includes rights to expression that I don't necessarily like or don't necessarily approve of. And so if you're asking me, do I think the pornography industry should exist? My answer would be no. Certainly not in its current form, unless it was...
Even if that harms people who make it and use it?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Even if that harms people who make it and use it?
In many circumstances, yes. I mean, there are some instances where I would absolutely say that you can regulate the porn industry, you can try to protect people to the extent possible. One of the things that actually might be extremely useful would be not to ostracize those who participated in this industry, which makes it more difficult for them to enter their economic spheres. And that's still a significant problem for many of them. Right?
Well, why is the incidence of pornography increasing as it becomes less and less stigmatized under this explanation?
I think there are a number of different reasons for that, right? I mean, probably the most obvious one
there's a very obvious one that seems to contradict your thesis, right?
No, well, the most obvious one that I can think of at this point is, of course, the rise of digital media, right? I mean, it used to be that this was a fairly niche industry that had high production costs associated with it, I should point out, right? And that's no longer the case, right? A lot of this can be produced by amateurs and sold for a lot of money and produced very, very quickly, right? And disseminated to a practically limitless audience. In those kinds of
internet's been around for about 25 years now.
Yeah, but I mean, and what have you seen? Right?
These trends go on inside the invention of the internet.
Yeah, and what have you seen? Right, there's been just a surge in the amount of amateur or digitally available pornography. Right, again, one of the things that people who make movies complain about is the fact that there's very little money to be made, and actually making some film for Playboy, or I have no idea what it was. Right, so whatever these companies were, because why would you invest $1 million in something that most people can get for free, and that can be reduced for pennies. Okay?
We're going to move on, but I don't think that explanation makes sense to me when I think the obvious explanation is that when you destigmatize it, people do it more.
Well, I think that's certainly partly true as well, right? But I think that our society has a very unusual attitude that it takes towards sex, right? And this is something actually Simone de Beauvoir talked about with, I think, great prophecy in her book, The Second Sex, where she described how it is that one of the reasons you've seen the collapse of puritanical or Catholic values around sexuality is in the Catholic tradition, there was this expectation that women were going to be the partners or companions of their husbands, and that they were going to play a vital teleological role in the propagation of the species in this kind of union, right? Whereas under capitalist conditions, women become a kind of social capital, right? That's why you have people throwing money at women in all these music videos, right? And the point is to try to accumulate as many of them as possible to demonstrate that you have the affluence and the power to compel women to find you attractive. Okay. And a lot of that has to do with the social conditions that have emerged starting in the 19th century. And that
sure. But this is sort of circling back to my point on all of this. Simone de Beauvoir, I never know how to pronounce the name, Simone de Beauvoir, and all these Marxists, if they're so prophetic and they see all of the disasters that are coming out of these consumptive habits that are coming from the market, then why do they turn around and actually support them? Why do they pour gasoline on the fire? That's what I'm saying. Simone de Beauvoir was also famous for thinking that it should be illegal for women to be housewives, that they need to be actually forced into the workplace via law. If she's so prophetic and she sees all of this as part of global techno-capital, then why is she pouring gasoline on the fire of global techno-capital?
Well, because I think that people make mistakes, right? I mean, I'm now not familiar with her famously claiming that people need to go into the workplace. I mean, I recall that she said that they should be encouraged to do so.
Oh, no, she said that should be not legally allowed to not go into the workplace. Right. Very famously.
I never saw that anywhere in her major work on The Second Sex. It might be in some other essay. If you'd like,
I believe it's a quote from. I believe it's a quote. It's not. I don't think it was written.
Okay, if you can find it,
whatever. But, the point is, it just seems that communism is the history of people, and they talk a great game. They're like, we're for the working class, we're the working class. But then they go out and do all of these things that just murder, screw over, destroy the working class. And I don't think that you can explain the history of communism as every time they go out and murder people and rape people and spread drugs and pornography and destroy the family. I don't think you can explain all those instances as being a long string of mistakes. They just accidentally killed all these people. They just accidentally raped all these people. They just accidentally encouraged all these social phenomenon that hurt the working class that they claim they wanted to protect. I don't see that as accident. Just seems like it's a very uncurious way to explain the actual history of this movement of Marxism.
Well, I don't know that I described it as an accident. I said that individual people make mistakes, and I think that's true, right? I mean, if you look at the history of Christianity, right? I mean, or liberalism for that matter also, you can see very similar phenomena, right? I mean, like I was saying, in 19th century England, which is often pointed to as the heyday or the golden age of unbridled capital, not only was England engaging in mass expansion across the globe at the expense of many different peoples, but there was more prostitution than any other time in history. And you could better bet there's probably more sexual exploitation going on at any other time in history. Right now, do we sit there and we say, well, the people who supported these kinds of movements, who supported progressive capitalism, were evil because they allowed this to happen? You might say they made serious mistakes, right? And we need to condemn them for that, and we should try to improve on what they did. And I think the same is true of someone like Simone de Beauvoir, right? She made some very serious errors in her life. One of them was actually suggesting that adults should be able to sleep with women who are under the age of, I think it was 14. I don't approve of that at all.
That's a very persistent error in feminist circles, I will point out. It seems like half of them made that error.
Whatever it happens to be, right? But we don't emphasize those kinds of things because they're not useful and they're not interesting, except from a historical perspective.
I'm just asking of the actual history of these ideological movements, because I think from a right-wing perspective, like I said, if you're an alien and you're analyzing the left, or I guess that's what right-wingers do, like Mencius Mollberg, who's a great right-wing thinker in the contemporary age, he said, let's look at communism and Marxism and socialism, and let's let's evaluate it by its actual actions and not its own propaganda. And these things look a lot less accidental, and they look like a pattern of behaviors that tells a different story about the history of these ideological movements. It's much less flattering than what the story socialists tell about themselves. But yeah, I find it more believable.
Yeah, I can understand that, right? But I mean, to a certain extent, that's your perspective, and I can appreciate that, right? But when you look at history from the lens of the failures of socialism, obviously you're going to sit there and just see it as a train of catastrophes, right? But if you decided to take an exclusively pessimistic look at any kind of ideology, like I said, you can make exactly the same kind of claims, right? Christianity is nothing if not a train of murders, religious wars, internecine conflicts, very pedantic disputes about ideology and idolatry, many of which resulted in unbelievable amounts of death and suffering. Right. The same is true of communism. The same is true of liberalism.
I would say that there's a very I think the history of Christianity is a much better track record than that of communism.
Well, I mean, you might say that, but I mean, think about the 30 years.
Certainly make that case.
30 years more.
We'll never be able to mill out those differences. We'll have to go over.
And again, I'm not sure these are necessarily to be settled by just purely quantitative evaluations either.
Yeah.
But the point that I'm trying to make is that you can look at history through rose-colored glasses, or you can look at history through, the blackest possible shades, if you want, right? What I'm saying that we should be doing is taking the best ideas from a tradition that I think actually has done a great deal to help people, has made significant mistakes along the way, and try to carry that forward. So you can, yes, point out the fact that there are many progressive movements that have done and supported terrible things. In my own country, for example, the man who introduced universal health care also supported mild eugenics programs. I think that's an atrocity. It doesn't mean I sit there and say, well, universal health care isn't something that we should embrace, because we should embrace it. And it's been extremely useful for Canada, as it has for many other countries across the globe. If you look at the socialist movements, through the 19th century, they also supported things like workers' rights. They supported better labor conditions. They supported the weekend. They agitated for higher wages, sometimes far higher than what we see today. The average worker for GM in the 1950s would have made
social democratic reforms are a thing, right? I mean, I guess
I'm speaking in very broad terms here about the labor and the left movement. You know what I mean? We had to thank them, for the weekend, stringent work conditions.
I don't know. Before we get on this high horse about, we could talk about what people who got us the weekend believed, right? And it's going to be any number of things, right? Including they're all Christians, right? All the people who fought for the weekends in the 8 days, they're all uniformly Christians, right? So I don't know. I just a lot of this just seems to be kind of propagandistic, I guess. I guess I don't really buy it. For me, what I would, I guess, want to pose to leftists is, first of all, I'm kind of curious about what is this big idea that, we're supposed to be taking from communism.
Well,
I see, a lot of these
I should say, first off, I'm not a communist, right? And I would never identify as such, and that's in part because I think Soviet and Maoist experiments with communism, not to mention the Khmer, were disasters, right? Unbridled disasters, really only beat in the 20th century by something like the advent of Nazism, right? And these are not models to emulate, and I think that there are built-in structural reasons why it is that they failed that have to do with the ideology underpinning them. What I think that we should be trying to do is adopt a liberal socialist perspective, which would be more consonant with the work of somebody like, say, John Rawls. And this has very deep roots in our tradition, including in Christianity, I should point out, and the stress that all people, it's stress that all people are moral equals, right? And this has deep roots in Christianity, the notion that all people are equal on the side of God, and it has deep roots in the liberal tradition and the notion that all men are created equal, or all women are created equal also. And the argument that liberal socialists will make is that all people are moral equals, then there's something seriously flawed about allowing them to be unequal in fact. There are certain inequalities that can be permissible under the right circumstances, but the kind of dramatic inequities that we see right now in life expectancies across many different metrics is a serious moral catastrophe, and it needs to be rectified as rapidly as we possibly can.
So I guess, there's plenty of things here. The first of all is that if we do this with communism, do we also get to do this with Nazi and fascist ideas? I certainly don't see the same standard applied to people like Julius Evola by the progressives. Usually it's, you quote Julius Evola, we deplatform you. Second of all, I guess, is I mean, I feel like we're just kind of going back to liberalism, right? We're saying that, oh no, we're going to go back to John Rawls and sort of this naive view of human liberty and human equality and human well-being, and we're going to ignore what we learned by observing how history actually plays out in the 20th century. So I guess the first question is,
I don't think that
how there seems to be a double standard. The second question is, isn't this Rawlsianism just more liberal naivety repackaged?
Well, I should say that Rawls saw many of his siblings die early on, and then he fought in the Second World War, and he was there in the aftermath of Hiroshima, right? So I don't think he had a particularly naive vision about what people were capable of. If anything, from very brutal experience, he was well aware of the intense unfairness of the world. And what he was saying is that what we should be trying to do, rather than accept that the world has to be this way, is instead take it upon ourselves to try to change it in as meaningful a way as possible, and using philosophy and critical thinking as tools to do that, amongst many others, I should say, right?
I would see Rawls as being one of the most influential thinkers on our current set of globalist elites.
Yeah, I certainly think that he is, right? But I mean, one of the things to point out is
it's led us to this situation we're in right now.
Well, the reason that I think it is in fact exactly the reasons he articulated in 2001, right? It's that society has moved further away from the ideal people like himself put forward, and it's moved further away under the auspices of neoliberal reforms. It's moved further away through the embrace of reactionary politics, and what we need to do in many senses is get back on the track that we were on through the 1950s through to about 1978 or so, and try to establish a society where people are going to be treated as moral equals by being treated as equals in fact, rather than allowing inequities that are calamitous for human well-being to exist simply because the people at the top think that it's useful for them.
So I guess I maybe I misunderstood. I thought you were a radical because it seems like you're saying that we need to go and double down on social democracy of the post-war period. Not, I mean, that's what you're saying. Not try some radically different political solution that tries to unseat a lot of the assumptions about social democracy and liberalism itself.
I think that liberal socialism is quite a radical idea at this point, right? And one of the reasons is because it's frankly never been
liberal
tried.
Socialism or social democracy, because there's a huge difference.
Well, I would say that the two are cousins, right? I mean, in some senses, social democracy is a step towards achieving something like a liberal socialist society of the type argued for by someone like John Rawls, or for that matter, someone like Jürgen Habermas, right? What I would say is the connection between the two is that we were moving on the road to the kind of society I think would be just in the periods that I was talking about, between about 1945 and 1978. And there were reforms being undertaken that I think were useful and helpful and benefited many people, particularly people in the working and the middle classes of developed states. And then this was also having a beneficial impact in many developing states as well, right? Starting in 1978, you saw a gradual erosion of these efforts.
So I'll take it that you see these things as being close cousins. Mm-hmm. I guess then I'll turn it around on you then. What do you make of radicals on the right and the left like myself? And why do you think, because it seemed throughout your book that you had a very low opinion. I noticed just a few minutes ago, you said reactionaries were responsible for the failure of these liberal programs, which in my language is ridiculous because reactionary means a right-winger who's not liberal, which means that blaming neoliberalism on reactionaries is kind of, well, at least in the language we use, is kind of contradictory. It's kind of contradictory. What should the relationship be going forward? I do not believe that social democracy has a solution to the problems we're currently dealing with. I want radical deviations from these systems. And I think that you're going to be seeing a lot of this. I guess I'm not exactly so sure who you believe the postmodern conservatives are, but I guess who do you think these postmodern conservatives are, and how do you see this playing into with your vision of how the future should unfold?
Well, I think one of the things to point out is that there was actually a reactionary undercurrent to many strands of neoliberalism, and this has actually been well articulated recently in people like Wendy Brown's book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, where she points out that people like Hayek, let alone people like Wilhelm von Röpke, paleoconservative figures, very much endorse the idea that tradition and traditional morality and Christian civilization needed to be preserved, not because they had any kind of intrinsic value in and of themselves. That certainly wasn't something they felt, but because they play an ordering role in enabling markets to spread more easily, and with people being less critical of them because they're focused on other things. And she talks about a number of the different ways in which this was so.
Yeah, I would be against those people, right? Like I believe that that's a ridiculous way to structure these ideas.
Well, I mean, one of the things that they point out, for example, like Ludwig von Mises is a very good example, right? Where in the 1920s, he wrote a letter talking about why it is that there can be no doubt, as he put it, that fascism has, at least for the moment, saved Western civilization. And it saved Western civilization because it's pushed strongly against the reformist movements that were emerging in Italy, and basically told the workers who's boss again, right? Now, we can have a discussion about, the exact whether or not he was accurate about that, and certainly he retracted his views later on. But this strand of thinking finds its way into a lot more iterations of neoliberalism than one might think. And I think recent scholarship has started to reveal.
I guess I'm not saying how this pertains to modern reactionaries like myself or the postmodern conservatives. Something said by a thinker in the 1930s. I mean, we have certain ideas that are against the modern notion of liberalism. Sure. We are anti-liberal right-wingers.
Okay.
I guess, is that the people you're talking about in the sort of postmodern conservative thing? And I guess how do we come to some kind of agreement going forward, or an agreement to disagree?
Yeah, and that's not a problem. So I should say that, first off, I don't think that all conservatives that exist today are postmodern conservatives. For example, I make a big distinction between religious conservatives who are genuinely dedicated to a faith tradition, and postmodern conservatives who tend to adopt the language of what's sometimes called cultural Christianity or cultural Christendom, who I think actually fall into the paradigm that I'm talking about.
Can I ask, who are these postmodern conservatives?
Sure. I mean, there's a number of them that I talk about, particularly in the...
Is it just Malinopoulos?
Yeah, I actually don't talk about him, but I mean,
I didn't hear you talk about Milo, but when I was looking at your description of postmodern conservatism, it seemed like the only person I was trying to imagine who this person was, who's just totally nihilistic.
I 100% see why you would point to him. The sad thing is his Sid Star had already started to fall around the time when I was writing the book, so it was just kind of not really a very contemporary thing to do. But
so who would the postmodern conservatives be if we were to just name names and Sure.
The people that I tend to list are people like Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, and Fidesz in Hungary, Matteo Salvini in Italy.
Are there any non-politicians?
Oh yeah, there are a lot of different theorists that I point to, but I don't want to get into that because it's a little bit idiosyncratic. If you want some public figures, I'd point to somebody like Dave Rubin. I absolutely would point to
Dave Rubin's a liberal.
I know, but allow me to explain, right? Well, I'll explain later on, right? I don't think that that's actually true in the sense that most liberals would appreciate it. At least most.
I'm not saying he's a leftist. I'm saying he's like a liberal.
Yeah, he's a liberal who also supports a wide variety of different reactionary figures, and consistently tends to frame his liberalism as an anti-progressivism, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who identify as liberals or leftists who I don't think have any of the views that would be consonant with that, or don't support any kind of positions that one would expect to be associated with that. So my argument is you can call yourself whatever you want. You might just not be diagnosing yourself honestly or accurately.
I don't know. I mean, when we started this conversation, I was pretty sure that I fell into this category of postmodern conservative. But as you describe it, is a host of neoconservative liberals, and maybe one nationalist mixed in there with Viktor Orban.
Well,
these people are the same. These people are the same career conservative politicians that were talking about Francis Fukuyama's End of History in the 90s, with slight variations put on them. Again, Viktor Orban possibly withstanding, almost none of those people embody what I believe is a reactionary or a radical right-wing anti-liberal.
Well, again, this is one of the things that I point out, right? I mean, postmodern conservatism isn't necessarily anti-liberal or even anti-capitalist in all its iterations. It can be in some instances, and one of the things I point about is that the Law and Justice Party and affiliated movements in Poland actually has a kind of anti-capitalist streak to it, which is a little bit unexpected, while still falling into the paradigm that I'm talking about. And one of the things that I point out is that postmodern conservatism varies across region and across personalities because the kind of conservatism that mutated into his postmodern iterations was more of an outlook or an attitude than a specific ideology. It was an outlook or an attitude that was very concerned with the preservation of order, fixated on the importance of identity and homogenous social identities in particular, and the importance those played in preserving social order. And obviously this varies across region in a variety of different and important ways. But under the conditions of postmodernity, people with this kind of disposition, and that includes politicians, but also the general public, started to appropriate and then use the kind of discursive tactics and technologies that were made available by postmodern culture in order to advance their distinctive strain of reactionary.
Sure. But I guess, I mean, as someone on the distant right, as someone who is incorporating ideas like Moldbug, I don't like Dugan, but I understand he's very popular.
I should say I have just a little bit of time left. So
okay, well, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to figure out how the movement I understand as being nationalist or reactionary or distant right fits into this conception, because I mean, I can say from experience, you could say that we're mistaken. We certainly believe the things we talk about, and and we're not career politician grifters who are trying to bring back liberalism under false pretenses. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out how this fits into the picture of this postmodern conservative, I guess.
Sure. Well, I should say off the start, right, that I'm not a psychologist, right, in any way, shape, or form, and frankly, you wouldn't want me to be analyzing you, right? So I can't sit there and individually tell you where you situate yourself on the political spectrum, or where I would situate you on the political spectrum, without us having a much more long discussion about a variety of different things, right? Mm-hmm. So whether you fall into the paradigm that I'm talking about, the only thing I could say is that you should maybe read the bigger book and think about that yourself, right? And try to think about it as reflectively and as open-mindedly as possible, right? When I'm talking about when it comes to the association of postmodern conservatism and nationalism, I think that certainly the resurgence of nationalism in a contemporary setting owes much to postmodern culture, because national identity is something that you could commit yourself to as a way of restabilizing your sense of who you are as an individual and who you should be as a collective, right? And that's a very tempting thing to turn to under the conditions of postmodernity, where people have increasingly been treated as atomized subjects whose sole purpose in life is various forms of consumerism in a competitive setting, right? But I don't think it's just nationalism that people have turned to. I think that also people have turned to civilizational identity with this new fixation on things like Western civilization and its enemies. I think people have also turned to religious identity, not usually in a very authentic way, in the sense that Kierkegaard.
Why do you say that?
Sorry?
Why do you say not in a very authentic way?
Because I would distinguish between somebody in the Kierkegaardian sense, right, who has an authentic religious relationship with God. And I say this is like an apostatized Catholic, right? And somebody who's appropriating the idea of God, or more particularly the idea of Christendom, as a way of making religion serve very human needs, right? And very human political needs.
And what you base the accusation of religious inauthenticity on?
Well, I'll give you a very good example of somebody like Yoram Mazzoni or Douglas Murray, right? Yoram Mazzoni has this very interesting essay called Against Conservative Rationalism. I might be getting the title wrong, where he says that
Douglas Murray, we're talking about the gay historian?
No, I'm talking about Yoram Mazzoni, the Israeli political theorist. Right?
Well, I don't know if he's even religious. He's certainly Jewish.
Yeah. He's an Orthodox Jew, and actually quite a committed one, I should say. So I don't think he even necessarily falls in this paradigm. But he wrote this very interesting thing in an essay that a lot of people have picked up on, and I think for good reason, where he said that, right now the task for conservatives, whether you believe or not that there is a God, is to say that my nation needs me to believe in God. The traditions of my nation require that I believe in God. And so I'm going to act like I do, even if I don't know that in my heart, right? And this is a very good example of what Kierkegaard and other theologians criticized in the 19th century. People like Paul Tillich in the 20th century, I should say, right? This notion
that's a long-standing Jewish tradition.
Oh, I know, absolutely.
That goes back to Maimonides.
Absolutely.
So was Maimonides not authentic?
Yes, he's interpreting it in a Jewish tradition very differently. But who he's referring to in this essay is, of course...
Maimonides was in the Jewish tradition, though, wasn't he?
Sorry?
Maimonides was in the Jewish tradition.
Yes, absolutely. No, the people that he's speaking to in this essay aren't specifically religious Orthodox Jews, where there would be some applicability with this idea, but conservatives more generally, hence the title, Against Conservative Rationalism, right? And one of the things that I point out is certainly from a Christian standpoint, the idea that you should believe in God, not because, or you should act like you believe in God, not because you actually do believe in God, or not because you're actually committed to what that religion says, but because it's useful for your nation, is very close to a kind of idolatry, right?
And to a Christian, but not to a Jew necessarily.
No, not necessarily. Right? And this is one of the things that
he's a Jew, right?
Yes. The reason that I'm bringing up,
I would consider that part of the authentic Jewish tradition. I don't disagree with it as a Christian.
It is absolutely part of the broader Jewish tradition, right? The reason that I'm singling this essay out as being important is because it's reflective of a broader attitude that many people have started to take when it comes to this idea of what's sometimes called cultural Christendom. Right, and you see again people like Douglas Murray agitating for that. And for that matter, you see people like Richard Spencer agitating for that, right, with this idea that we're cultural Christians, right? And the notion is that we don't necessarily believe that there is a God. We don't necessarily believe that any of the actual doctrines about Christian ontotheology is true, but we do believe that it's important for us to act as though they are true, for the sake of preserving our sense of national identity and solidarity, and so on. And I think that's an inauthentic way of approaching particularly Christian doctrine in particular, but I would also be willing to other forms of doctrine as well.
You mentioned none of them claim to be Christians.
Well, they claim to be cultural Christians, right? And again, we can have a debate about whether that means they actually are Christians or whether they're not. My claim would be not. Right?
Richard Spencer does not claim to be a Christian. I need to say that.
It was in 2016 where he said that I'm a cultural Christian in an interview that he
sure. I mean, whatever that means.
Yeah, well, this is the point. Whatever that means, right? And the reason
that's not an inauthentic expression of religion. That's just I don't believe in religion. I just like the cultural elements.
No, but I think it is an inauthentic expression.
I'm the best Christian ever. Oh, by the way, you don't actually have to believe this. That would be an inauthentic expression.
Yeah, but I think it is an inauthentic. I don't want to get too much into this, right? Because again, I do have to go, right? But sure. Again, one of the things that Kierkegaard talks about in his very interesting book, Attack on Christendom, that I think predicted a lot of what you're seeing right now is that in a mass age where people feel lonely and anomic, and they feel that they do not have an identity that's sufficiently stable, particularly the collective identity that's sufficiently stable to give them a sense of meaning in life, one of the things that they might turn to is this ideal of Christendom, right? That we're part of a Christian civilization that has certain values. These are reflected in the states and the politics of the time, and our goal should be to live out our lives according to these values. And he said that this is actually going to be the biggest threat to genuine or authentic religious faith going forward, not atheism or even progressive, secularism, but this kind of easy, cheap cultural Christianity that suggests that the most important thing about religious doctrine is not God or your relationship with God, but whether or not the values of your civilization are being upheld, and making sure that as many people as possible are hold to them.
I guess first of all, I see something wrong with presenting yourself as a Christian and not believing. I don't see what's so wrong about saying, I don't believe, but I'm still part of this cultural object that is a real historical fact. I know tons of Jews and Muslims who say just that. As long as there's not a deception, I don't see what's wrong with it. And as far as the prediction goes, I just see it as manifestly historically false. The idea of Christendom essentially died after the First World War, and Christianity has had its worst century ever. So, and it certainly was not at the hands of people who were fighting in the name of cultural Christianity, as weak as that is, and as sort of a half measure that is.
This is one of the things that I try to point out with this notion of postmodern conservatism, right? I mean, these people aren't necessarily looking for an authentic relationship with something that they understand very well. Right, what they're looking for.
How do you know it's not authentic, though?
You mean what do I mean by authentic?
How do you know that the emotions someone feels when they're affiliated with being Jewish? How do you know that Yoram Harzozis? How do you know that the Israelis' affiliation with Judaism, even though he doesn't believe in God necessarily, how do you know that that's inauthentic? What does that even mean? That
I don't actually think that it is in his case, right? Because I think that he's a very dedicated practitioner of Orthodox Judaism, and
How do you know it's inauthentic in anyone's case? Like, I know lots of people who feel a very deep affiliation with their culture, be it African American or Japanese or Jewish, as we were just saying, or Muslim or Persian, or any various combination of them. How can we say that feeling a deep affiliation with the past is just necessarily inauthentic unless you believe A, B, and C in this way at this time and doing these particular things? I understand that there's a misrepresentation how it's dishonest. I just don't see how that very emotion is by itself inauthentic. If it's explicit, if it's saying like, I just feel affiliation with this history.
I don't think that it does necessarily have to be inauthentic, right? I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book is how it is that the affective relations that people have to these idealized or pastiche-like identities is more inauthentic than iterations of the same kind of attachments that have existed before, right? And the reason is because a lot of these individuals aren't necessarily turning to these cultural objects or these cultural ideals, if you want, as they truly are. What they're turning to is a pastiche-like representation of them, particularly as presented in various postmodern media, and attaching themselves to them as a way of stabilizing their sense of self.
So how would I tell if my Jewish neighbor is authentically enamored of his Jewish culture or if he's enamored of a pastiche?
Again, I don't know. I have to tell me who it is.
How did you know when you wrote it?
Well, because again, I'm talking about a social phenomenon at this point that refers to very particular personalities that can be taken as representative of a more broad social trend, right? I mean, if you want to talk about somebody like, say, Donald Trump and why it is that he has an authentic relationship with nationalism, I think the idea is because he's appropriating it and the rhetoric associated with nationalism to advance his own political agenda, and he probably doesn't really have much of an interest in the nation's traditions, or frankly, in very much of anything aside from himself and his own political pursuits, right? If you're talking about someone like Viktor Orban, please let me finish.
Everyone knows that Donald Trump.
Let me finish. Okay. If you're talking about somebody like Viktor Orban and how his understanding of Hungarian nationalism is unauthentic, there's an even more obvious reason, right? And that's because Orban, who was a progressive for a very long period in his life, he was actually sponsored by the Soros Foundation to go study abroad. And when he came back, he denied all these things by trying to present himself as somebody whose history was very different than his own personal history in order to advance his political agenda. And this appeals to a lot of people, of course, because it provides a sense of identity stabilization in an increasingly unmoored world. But it's not the kind of thing that I think we should be endorsing. Sorry. I'm sorry, I'm afraid I couldn't hear your last comment.
I don't see how your conclusion follows from just that observation.
Well, it doesn't. I mean, there's a long book that's explaining this. I mean, we could get into the determinants of postmodern culture, why it is that it emerged as a result of secularism, liberalism, and capitalism. That's the general thesis that I tend to make. We can talk about why it is that people with certain reactionary dispositions felt the way that they do about postmodern culture and the sense of enemy that they experience under it. I mean, all this is stuff that we haven't really gotten into, since for most of our discussion has actually been about socialism and the left and why apparently the left is responsible for all the ills of our society. Right?
No, I'm not saying the left is responsible for all the ills of the society. I'm saying that the explanations the left has of itself don't explain.
Well, that's fine. But I mean, again, we didn't really talk about the book all that much, and unfortunately, I don't really have a lot of time to do it right now.
Okay, well, do you have anything you'd like to say going out?
No, I should just say again, I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk to you, because I did really enjoy this conversation, and I do think it's important.
Oh yeah, it was great
to have cross-ideological discussions, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the kind of progressivism that I endorse. Like I said, not stuff that's relegated to the vampire castle, but that tries to reach out and convince people and to facilitate a more democratic and cosmopolitan culture. So
okay,
and I should say also, I'm happy to take, I guess, one or two questions.
Sure. If people have questions they want to ask from the chat, we can do that. Obviously, so the book is called Postmodern Conservatism.
What is postmodern conservatism? And then there's the rise of postmodern conservatism, which is a bit of the more fancy title, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, the rise of postmodern conservatism, and I think, while we're waiting, I'm just going to tell the chat that this is please post your questions now to either me or to my guest, Professor McManus. I hope I'm now pronouncing that correctly. I think that, well, I guess I kind of dropped a bomb on my community this week when I said that I think that I'll ask a preemptive, very non-aggressive question, since it was getting a little contentious there at the end.
That's okay.
But the excuse me. I think that, I dropped a bomb on my computer this week by saying that we should reach out to the left and see what we have that unifies us. Do you think that there's any radical right and radical left opportunities for cooperation? And where might you see promising opportunities for that?
Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of areas for cooperation, right? Although it's going to take a really long and difficult set of discussions in order to reach a kind of commitment to what we share and what we should be doing going forward. The biggest area where I think we tend to agree is actually one that you signposted at the very beginning, right? The best progressives and the best conservative thinkers have pointed out that we live in an anomic age where people feel a lack of meaning and a lack of identity. And there are a wide variety of different reasons this has happened, but it's something that's bad and it's something that needs to be fixed, right? Now, of course, we differ on where the solutions to fixing this would be, but I think that would be an interesting place where we could start to have a discussion, right? And if you want two thinkers who I think both talk about this problem of meaning in interesting and innovative and insightful ways on different ends of the political spectrum, the two you mentioned, right? Mark Fisher and Patrick Denis, right? Both agree that we live in an anomic civilization where people feel a lack of meaning. Both think that capital played a fundamental role in generating it.
So I have two questions for you from the chat when you're ready to take them, just FYI. But
sure.
continue.
Yeah, no, and I'm just saying that I think, if people were intellectually interested in where they can start drawing parallels, that might be a good place to start. Looking at Denis's work, his critiques of liberalism, and then looking at somebody like Fisher, or for that matter, going back and looking at somebody like Adorno and McIntyre.
I think that a lot of those, the Frankfurt School is sometimes people throw the baby out with the bathwater, oftentimes a lot with the Frankfurt School and with people who derive from Adorno and others. And I think that people who want to consider themselves intellectuals on the right, they need to examine those thinkers. Post-Gramscian Marxism is definitely something that we need to take on board, especially since it has so many parallels to the right. But let me just get these questions to you. Pardon me?
Sorry, no, I was going to say I agree with you, actually, right? And I know some interesting conservative thinkers who are doing just that, and I really think it's something to be praised and encouraged, right?
Great. So there's two questions came up earlier, so I want to make sure that I ask them both to you before you leave. You can answer them in whatever order, or if you don't want to answer one, you don't have to. But I want to make sure to get to these two questions. So Charlemagne asks, great YouTuber, by the way, everyone subscribe. He asks, how does metamodernism differ or build on postmodernism? I don't know if you can answer that or if you understand the question.
It's a little bit difficult. I've seen the term metamodernism.
Well, let me get the second one out, and then you can pick one or answer them both. Robin Watertree asks, why is social liberalism a viable solution when the welfare state has produced such bad results in minority and working class communities? Do you want to take a shot at either of those questions?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to take both of them. So I'll start with the first one, right? It depends on what you mean by metamodernism, right? I've seen that term used in a variety of different ways. The way that I've typically seen it used, and this is just what I'll answer, right, is metamodernism is sometimes characterized as hypermodernism, right? Or the idea that what we're seeing right now isn't necessarily a retreat from the modernist logics that have been with us since the 18th century at the very least, but the kind of radicalization, right? That modernity has really just gotten started, right? You can see that with the emergence of things like transhumanism or posthumanism or cybernetic technologies and so on.
Nick Land would be a big figure in this.
Yeah, exactly. So can I just ask you, is that what you think Charlemagne is referring to?
To be quite honest, I have no idea. I have no understanding what metamodernism is.
Okay, that's just the way I've seen the term used.
Nick Land was the only idea I ever had about what this was.
Fair enough. Yeah, I'll try my best to answer it, operating on the presumption that that's what he means. But my feeling is that there are certain elements of hypermodernism or metamodernism interpreted this way that we should embrace, and that's in part because I think that there's a Promethean impetus behind some of the most interesting trends going on in modernist discourse and modernist technology right now. And this can be an expression of human creativity that would be unparalleled in history, and it could produce some very interesting results that could also benefit a huge number of different people. Where I think the danger lies, of course, is when the logics of hypermodernism or metamodernism assume a kind of determinism of their own, and we're no longer able to control them or even have choices available to us about what it is that we'd like to do. And I think this is something that you're starting to see right now with the advent, for example, of genetic technologies. So CRISPR technologies, for example, that have to do with the genetic manipulation of people at a very fundamental level are something that we need to be very careful with. But there's a serious worry that if the Chinese or other developed countries start to get a head start on developing these kinds of CRISPR technologies, there'll be a bit of a race or a very strong impetus for everyone to get on board without having the kind of moral discussions that we should about the uses of these kinds of technologies and these kinds of genetic manipulation. I think like everything else, it's a double-edged sword, right? We should take the Promethean elements of meta or hypermodernism and carry them forward while making sure that we're always having very serious discussions about what exactly we want to be doing rather than allowing these things to assume a life of their own and become some kind of Frankensteinian beast consuming us all.
Did you want to take a whack at the welfare state destroying minority and working class communities?
Sure. Could you just repeat the question as it was stated?
Why is social liberalism a viable solution when the welfare state has produced such bad results for minority and working class communities?
Well, I would say that, I don't think that it's produced a bad result for minority and working class communities in all instances or even in most instances, right? Certainly there are some circumstances where you can talk about how it is that welfare dependence has had a corrosive impact on marginalized people. And in those kind of cases, we can talk about why the policies failed, and we can talk about what it is that should be done to improve them or whether they should have existed at all. And one example of this that I can think about that I actually did some research on is the way something like legal aid is structured, right?
What was that? I missed that. Legal what?
I did a doctoral research on how legal aid functions. And one of the things legal aid.
What's that?
In Canada, it's where money is made available to people who essentially need to hire a lawyer in order to resolve. Yeah.
Well, I think she said social liberalism. I think she was referring to the things we were talking about before, like basically decline of marriage, influx of drugs.
Okay, but this is an example.
That's why I associate with social liberalism.
Yeah, this is just an example I'm giving of where the welfare state sometimes doesn't function as well as it can, because and in these cases there were a lot of bad policies surrounding how it is that you provide legal aid, and I won't get into it. It's
sure.
Specific, right? So in the kind of instances where we can talk about how it is that welfareism has failed people, we need to look at those policies, assess why they failed, and assess whether we should have a policy in these kind of cases, and what reforms need to be made. But when it comes on the broader question of whether or not social democracy has helped people, I think it absolutely has, and it certainly did during its heyday, right? During the 1950s, for example, GM workers would earn the equivalent of about $40 an hour right now.
No, I have to just so you're answering the question. This person probably would support social democratic welfare. They were asking about social liberalism, like
okay.
The drugs, the sex, the decline of the family, that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I misunderstood the question then. So you're talking about like social permissiveness, that kind of idea?
Well, yeah. Well, I think the question is welfare might be okay if we could impose strict regulations on making sure people form families. Mm-hmm. But what seemed to not work was the introduction of the welfare state plus drugs plus declining marriage rates, premarital sex, and that just seemed to explode in all sorts of bad ways. I don't know. I feel like we see there's tons of examples of this. I have personal stories. We see it in the statistics when it comes to Black America and rural America. We see it so clearly. I'm not saying there isn't a way that welfare could work, but the combination of welfare with social liberalism, e.g., sex, drugs, permissiveness, that's, I think, what the concern was.
Sure, and I should say, I've had buddies of mine who've been fucked up by drugs and alcohol, like I'm sure many people do, right? And these are bad things, and they make you really think about your life and what's important, and that's something that we should all be trying to do, both individually and collectively. When it comes to like my support for social liberalism, the reason that I endorse it is for two reasons, right? One of them is what I mentioned, which is that state efforts to try to prevent people from doing what they want tend to produce effects that are far worse than the disease. Now, this isn't true in all circumstances, but it's true in many circumstances, particularly those related to drugs and alcohol. Now, does this mean that the state shouldn't be taking efforts to try to encourage people to engage in more welfare optimizing of behavior? I think no. I think what we can be trying to do, drawing on somebody like Cass Sunstein, is nudge people using incentives and sometimes sticks as well towards more optimal behavior without necessarily using the criminal justice system in particular to try to prevent them from doing things that they're going to do one way or another, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a consequentialist argument that I'd make for social liberalism.
Sure.
A Millsian argument that's more principled that I would make for social liberalism is that, quite frankly, we don't know what the best kind of life is. I mean, there have been philosophers who've debated about this for thousands and thousands of years, and many have come up with very interesting and even very persuasive answers. But there's also a lot of deviation between them. And what social liberalism bets in this kind of Millsian way is an opportunity for different people to engage in different experiments of living, as you put it. And then the rest of us can draw on the resources of this experiment to see what we think is best, both in our own life and socially.
Most people would consider the experiment that we ran to be failed at this stage with the sexual. I mean, well, this is the thing. Like, if you had told people we were going to run an experiment on no-fault divorce, and they looked and they saw our society, they would consider that a failed experiment.
Well, I'm not sure they would, right? I mean, in many circumstances, there are women who have been. Well, I mean, you can look at, for instance, the impact that's had on women, right? And the benefits that have accrued from the fact that women are now able to leave abusive relationships or economically deprived relationships in a manner that wasn't available to them before, right? And I think you can also look at this from a number of different perspectives that are analogous to that. But the kind of general point is that it shouldn't be for the state to decide which experiments have failed and which have not through the criminal justice system, right? Or through legal regulation. There are instances where we can try to nudge people in the right direction, where we know that certain experiments in living have negative consequences, but that's very different than regulating it in the way that societies traditionally have. And it's one of the boons and the insights of social liberalism, I think, to have gotten past that. So,
would you agree? This isn't part of the question, but this is curious. Would you agree that we should nudge people towards getting married, or nudge people away from having abortions, or nudge people away from having promiscuous sexual behavior?
Well, that's a lot of different questions about a lot of different things, right?
Any of the three?
Well, I'll tackle the marriage issue because I just got married last year, right? And I'm very happy with my wife. So, I mean, I think that what's more important than getting married per se is trying to find a meaningful relationship with somebody, right? And I think that having formal institutions to allow you to reflect your love for one another can be extremely helpful, right? I don't think people should be required to enter into them, but they should be made available. And in the event that people want to use them, they should be supported when doing so, right?
Okay. So do you have to go now? Because there's just tons more questions.
I'll take one more,
okay.
And then I have to go do some work.
Well, thank you in advance for taking the questions. Let me see if I can grab.
I do apologize. It's just I have.
No, it's fine. We have the time we have, right? Okay. Sorry. Give me a second here. I lost my place here. Okay. Okay. There's some people asking if you'd want to debate Jay Dyer. I don't think that's a real question. He is.
I don't like debating all that much, right? I'll be honest with you. I did a debate with Stefan Molyneux. That was a draining experience, and I don't think really anything all that interesting came of it. I kind of prefer these kind of things, right? Heated discussion's fine, but discussion.
Okay. Yeah, I think it was very interesting hearing all of the ideas.
Yeah.
Okay, are Trump's election and Brexit examples of postmodern conservatives becoming a force in politics, or merely an opening of the political safety valve, as it were? I think he means a safety valve for neoliberalism.
That's a very good question, and it's actually something that I've been thinking about a little bit more recently, partly because I've rejigged my own interpretation of neoliberalism in light of reading Wendy Brown's books, which everyone should, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism. She published it, I think, just last year. In terms of like whether or not Trump's election constitutes a victory for postmodern conservatism and Brexit, I think they absolutely do. This is the moment where you've seen postmodern conservatives move out of digital spaces or out of these kinds of isolated cultural enclaves and move into the big leagues, right? And I think many people are very well aware of this, right? With the kind of ascension of a reality TV star to president of the United States, or in the Brexit case, the decline of Cameron-type conservatism and the ascendancy of somebody like Johnson, who's well known for the kind of entertainment value he brings to politics, to the highest office of the land. Whether or not this represents a continuation or a break with neoliberalism, I think that depends on the country, right? So I think that if you look at somebody like Viktor Orban, who I've discussed a little before, or Law and Justice in Poland, maybe even Matteo Salvini in Italy, there pretty clearly is a break with the neoliberal order, particularly the EU-driven neoliberal order that was kind of hegemonic for the previous 30 years, right? And you can see this in a lot of the policies they adopt, not to mention the attitudes they have. I think the case is a little bit different if you look at somebody like Johnson, let alone like Trump, right? I think Trump, in particular, came to power on this populist platform, promising to deliver higher quality healthcare and to drain the swamp and beat back the elites. And he's run probably the most corrupt administration that we've seen in recent American history. And most of the policies that he's enacted have been to the benefit of big corporations. You can look at his tax cuts as a kind of signature instance there. So I think it's a little bit different there. And I think there's a bit more of a continuity with what came before when it came to his election. And Johnson also.
Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm going to try to expediently answer the rest of the chats, but I know you have to be going, Professor. So just thank you for stopping by and talking about your book, Postmodern Conservatism.
Sure. And if people want to email me, it's Matt McManus 300@gmail.com. Or you can add me at Matt Paul Prof. Just a picture of me with like a banner and stuff. So I'd be happy to take any more questions there when I don't have 2 lectures that I have to prepare for tomorrow.
Thank you very much. So in the remaining time, I'll just answer the questions coming from the chat. I see that there's a few of them here that are directed towards me. Iron Duke 99 says, well, I think there's super chats first. I apologize. I may have missed them. And I think StreamYard's now fixed. Guys, I apologize already for me not quite understanding the ropes of StreamYard. Well, I'll answer chats, I guess. I'll say this. I did probably violate my policy of politeness a little bit when we got into the they're not authentic Christians deal. That's something that I've grown to distrust dialectics, politically motivated dialectics about who's an authentic Christian or who has a right to actually be proud of their ethnic heritage. In my experience, it's been used cynically so much that I just don't trust it anymore. I think that if of course there's explicit things. Religions have explicit standards. You can't cheat on your wife. You can't have an abortion. All these things like that. But when it gets to things along the lines of, this is what I consider to be good, and this person's not doing what I consider to be good. So how could they actually be authentically in favor of their religion, which purports to be good? I just feel that really gets into a gray area. So I'm going to try to access my super chats so I can do them first. Paul Cornelius for $4.99. Thank you very much. He says, no cathedral chat? Bummer. Thanks for the good work. Well, thank you very much. I'm not so sure how much I could have talked about the cathedral with Professor McManus, because I don't think he's familiar with Mencius Mollbug or the more recent neo-reactionary idea space. And so I'm not sure that there would have been, using jargon's never a very good idea. So we have Daywin Ether for $2. Will you archive this stream? I cannot say. Yes, it will be on my channel. And then another super chat for $5 for Will Timothy Norman Johnson. I really think you need to do an after action analysis of this stream. I guess I could talk about it a little bit with on a distance. Perhaps that might be a good idea. Edited after action analysis might be something that will go the way of the dodo, considering that I really want to prioritize the time I have for edited videos to focus on things that are higher quality. I released a series of videos that were technically edited this last weekend about me and my wife's favorite movies, and they were really lower quality than your average distributed edited video, and they did really, really badly. So I think I might if there's thing that this analyze this idea really quickly, I think it can be done in a live stream. That would be a lot easier. So, well, thank you for your contribution. And, I think it went well. The problem, I think, is obviously this is sort of the problem with intellectual conversations about larger movements, is that obviously Matt McManus he believed that he sort of wanted to. I don't think he really wanted to group me in with this group of charlatans and politicians, but this whole idea that postmodern conservatives aren't authentic religious believers. I don't know. My community is authentic in its religious belief, as far as I can tell. Ultimately, the question about what is authentic Christian is eternal. If you profess the Nicene Creed and adhere to their religious strictures explicitly of Christianity, then you are a Christian in some sense. As for, are you authentic in an ultimate sense? That's the answer. That's a question that only God can answer. And that's a question that we'll all have to face down at the end of time, very likely. And I'm not even so sure where I fall in that dividing line. As Solzhenitsyn says, the dividing line between good and evil runs through men's hearts. So, yeah, when it comes to, I can easily say that, my neighbor doesn't follow kosher eating laws. That's just a fact. Whether that makes him an inauthentic Jew because he just likes to feel like he's part of Jewish history, he's part of this nation of people that lived for thousands of years. I just feel really, it's really, that doesn't seem to be something that I'd like to put out as part of a political movement. Spaghetto says for $10, hey Dave, good to see you. I thought it was a real red flag when Matt hand-waved the mass murders of communism and then contrasted it to Locke's view on minorities in terms of bad things people did. Well, I mean, but let's, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I can see what you're saying, but let's just play devil's advocate. I think that a lot of times boomer conservatives have been too quick to go, Mustalin means I don't have to actually seriously intellectually engage with Marxism. And because of that, a lot of our disagreements about Marxism have become dull over the years. We've leaned back on the idea that, well, because politicized Marxism has killed so many people. And really, when you look at, when you actually adjust for time, yes, it's way more people than any religious movement ever has in the past. I don't think that it's an intellectually interesting idea to disqualify ideas that way. But the problem is, obviously, in a political sense, the left does this. The left does this. I really don't see Ben Burgess taking seriously National Bolshevism or National Socialism as an ideology. I don't see him saying, oh, well, the Nazis killed millions of Jews, but that doesn't disqualify their ideas. I think most people in that school, there's a double standard there. And I think that as long as we bring up the mass democide that the communists do as a double standard to platform radical right-wing ideas, I think we're onto something. But don't use it as a crutch and that's what the boomer neocons did. They used it as a crutch against communism. Intellectuals take on the ideas at their face. what's the main critique against Marx? Well, for his economic theory, it would be obviously labor theory of value is bunk. I don't know how you get around that. And that's certainly a legitimate critique against communism if you want to make it. As always, I'm just going to be scanning the chat for replies as I see them and as they appear to be interesting to me in the next 10 minutes. Or if you have a super chat, I'll definitely be sure to answer that. Yeah, I mean, there's another question here I see about how democracy works. I just think it was too short of a discussion to get into that. The one interesting thing, and I was kind of caught off guard by this, when I was reading his book, it seemed that he was just so against this idea of markets. And I hope I'm not confusing him with who's the person who offered capitalist realism. Oh my God, I'm losing my mind. I think I'm not getting enough sleep. I hope I'm not confusing him with another Zero Books author. But my reaction seemed to suggest that he had a very negative attitude towards market-based social systems. But it seemed that in this debate, he was arguing for basically post-war fusionism, post-war social democracy. And I don't know how you have a social democracy without doing this whole, the whole idea of social democracy is that we're going to run free market globalization to generate large profits that we can tax and then use the taxes from the profits to prop up social programs. If you start chopping away at mass immigration and globalization and consumerism, the way that Mark Fisher would, or the way that a lot of other radicals on the left would, you're going to lose those profits, and the entire idea of social democracy kind of gets destroyed. So, I don't see how that can be reconciled, and that would certainly have to be a bigger conversation. So another super chat here for Coda Witty. Okay. If you're going to want me to say your name, there's Code Adwy, let's say, for $2. He asks, how do we reverse the decline of Catholic priesthood? So this is a great question. I don't know if anyone really has a great answer for it, but I think we all have passable answers. The passable answer is create thick Catholic communities. The difficulty with creating thick Catholic communities, and this has been sort of a change in my own opinion since, this has been a change in my own opinion since I've started this channel. We need a Benedict option to create thick Catholic communities, but you need a set of Charlemagne. You need a Charlemagne, or at least a set of Merovingians, to create the political conditions where it's even possible to create thick Catholic communities without harassment from the apparatus of the cathedral or from woke global techno capital. So I just don't see how the sort of Rod Dreher Benedict option, which is in its fundamentals, it's true. If you create Benedict option, the Catholic communities, you're going to get an increase of men pursuing the priesthood. I guarantee it. But that's going to require a larger political movement that's going to have to throw down with a lot of forces that are very, very hostile. I mean, we're going to have to confront things like porn. We're going to have to confront things like drugs. We're going to have to confront things like sexual culture and the decline of any workable sexual culture in the modern world. And I think that, I'm not saying that there isn't a way that leftists can't kind of go halvesies on this stuff, as it seemed that Matt McManus was, saying something like, and, Matt McManus is sort of, I disagree with it, it's bad, but there's some kind of fundamental right. Maybe this is a new opinion on the left. It's certainly not new on the right. That's the libertarian position. And this libertarian position is the one that essentially presided over the last 25 years when our society's gone down the drain with pornography addiction and drug addiction and all sorts of social problems. So Paul Cornelius for $10. Thank you very much. Won't postmodernity be a challenge to narrative and narrative construction? I figured the guest would talk about right-wingers who deconstruct modernist assumptions. What happened? Well, I kind of did too, actually. I don't know. I think there's sort of two things going on here, and I don't want to disagree with the guest when he's not here to defend himself. But there seems to be sort of two heads to this thing, right? There's the capitalist realism. We need a radical change to the system if we're going to reconstruct postmodernity, modernity, and quote unquote capitalism. I don't like the word capitalism because I think it's hopelessly vague for these purposes, but we all know what we're talking about. Late 20th century corporate and post-industrial market-driven systems. There's the sort of Mark Fisher, we need to question this and reform it in a radical way, that I kind of heard from some of McManus's essays. And then from other McManus's essays and from this conversation, I hear that this is basically a specific complaint about specific hypocrisies pursued by specific political figures like Donald Trump and Viktor Orban and Boris Johnson. And I am incredibly not interested in the hypocrisy of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson and Viktor Orban. I hear it every day from CNN. I hear it every day from everyone in the political circle of Progressive Town, California. I've done it. I've gotten the T-shirt. And even if Donald Trump was a hypocrite, and even if Viktor Orban was drinking his wine out of the skulls of children that he murdered, it wouldn't solve this problem of modernity that we're dealing with. I don't see it. I think that we have to at some point confront at least the consumption habits, at least how postmodernity, at least how this modernity is causing us to live or not live. So, Tales of Ruin for $2. Do you have a favorite historical statesman? Yeah, I have a bunch of them. The one that's coming to mind right now is Emperor Meiji from the late 19th century. I just admire so much his ability to be the exact right person for the age, to see the conflict between globalism and traditionalism and devout religious belief and that which will crush it from the outside. Him being able to see that and go and so deftly and so, I know he made mistakes. There's a huge suppression of Buddhism during his reign that, as anyone who's a devout religious believer, whenever I see religious suppressions like that, I immediately think that this is just horribly sinful and terrible. But, oh man, how can you fault somebody who's able to save their society and build a new society that's that strong? It just seems to me to be remarkable. Other people I would admire, I guess, I've been drawn to a lot of figures from late antiquity. Charlemagne would be one of them. The Merovingians get a bad rap because they were a bunch of insane barbarians who probably didn't believe half the things they said about Christianity, and they certainly weren't very educated. But they played a historical role that was necessary. It was impossible for not to be necessary. And I have to admire them for that. The problem, and this is the thing, every society has politicians that are brilliant, and it really is a radically historicized exercise to figure out who the great politicians were. The reason why I pick Meiji and the reason why I pick people from late European antiquity is because I think that their civilizational circumstances are very similar to our own, and that's why I gravitate towards them. So I hope that answers your question. I'm running out of time, so guys, I'm going to have to ask the super chats to stop. I'll answer one or two more questions, but I'll try to get them in a future distance. MJR Snyder for $50 Canadian. Wow, thank you very much. It really goes a long way, guys. Thank you. And obviously, I don't run this channel for money, but my family always needs money. Babies. Maybe you can hear them in the background. They're not cheap. But so thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. Great chat, but I thought you were a bit antagonistic at points. Yeah, I agree. I was antagonistic. I didn't feel like I was unnecessarily antagonistic until we got to the whole inauthentic religious thing. That kind of got me a little bit. But this is always the division. Obviously, with someone you disagree with so much, a lot of people just want me to lay into the person, and believe me, given my family's history with militarized Marxists and given my own distaste for Marxism, my natural instinct is to see Marxism. I guess I shouldn't say he's a Marxist. He wasn't, but my own reaction to leftists is to always try to nail them down with a hammer. But to answer your question, MJR Snyder says, I think Matt's point about authentic versus inauthentic religious and cultural expression is worth engaging with, especially with regards to the insincerity of a lot of boomer conservatives. Okay, wow. Getting this at the end of a stream. Man, I wish I could dedicate a stream to answering this question, and since it's a fairly generous super chat. Okay, this is something that I talked to the Franklin recently, and I can't remember if it was this conversation or a previous one. Okay, yes, you're absolutely right. We need to have a conversation about the authenticity of how a lot of boomers practice their religion. You've never said a truer word, and thank you for bringing it up. But dudes, and I don't know how we're going to do this. And, Franklin and I discussed how do we enforce ethical behavior inside right-wing communities. And obviously some recent scandals involving YouTubers that I won't bring up came up. But Franklin, he said it correctly then. He said, we cannot have the left put to us a conversation publicly about who be the authenticist Christian. If you do this, you will give the left carte blanche to destroy any form of solidarity. It will be an endless contest about who is the next Saint Benedict, and they will pick us off one by one. They'll have every one of us call out all the other people as being inauthentic. You think I never done anything sinful? Do you think I don't spend money on frivolous things? It's hard to say this, someone could give me $50, and I assure you I will put this towards family and all this stuff, but I've given into consumerism. I'm weak. I'm flawed. If we allow the left to conduct inauthentic Christian, every one of any of our hobbies that seem to not be in line with the purest realization of Saint Benedict and Thomas Aquinas will immediately be used to create accusations of inauthenticity against the movement. It will be the distributor likes Magic the Gathering. He's a whore of modernity. Don't listen to him, or something like that. We cannot. This conversation has to be dealt with like the radioactive stuff that it is, very carefully and in spaces that we control. If we allow the left to use this to subvert us, it will be over before it begins. So thank you very much, MJR Snyder, for that super chat. That is such a large question. I hope that statement did what it could. The Hooser for $5. Distributist. Who am I if someone's on the right who's not a neocon but can't stand most dissident right figures? I'd say you're normal. Okay, but look, so the dissident right, and this is another thing that I talked about with the Franklin, and maybe this is the thing, this is something I talk about with people behind the scenes, but if we were to talk about this publicly, it would almost invariably invite, even if we were to be anonymous about it, it would invite speculation and gossip that we don't want to welcome. But fringe movements attract troubled people. That's a fact. If you have a fringe person, the dissident right figures are going to be troubled people. And so you can say, oh, well, troubled people, we don't need morally compromised people. End of story. Sure, you're not going to have any dissident movements then. Or the dissident movement you create is going to only be in effect when the effects we describe are obvious. If you want to create a distant right movement after societal collapse is imminent, then the standard of implying strict moral circumstances will get you that. I and a lot of other people believe that these kind of conversations that the dissident right is having, they need to happen because the ideas are important and they need to be discussed before we hit the major societal collapse. And we're already seeing kind of prefigurations of it in this whole coronavirus thing. And that is something that if you believe the ideas of the dissident right are valuable, I would say that you're at least sympathetic to reactionary ideas. You're fully within your right to dislike anybody on the dissident right. God knows that I dislike many people personally on the dissident right. Now, I don't really like airing my grievances with personal dislike of people. I know I said that I personally disliked the style of certain people on streams before, but I don't feel need to reiterate it again and again and again and again. So with that, that's the last of the super chats. So thank everyone who's come in. Unfortunately, I'm totally out of time now. Thank you for listening in. And I would obviously like to thank the guest today. And hopefully I will come out with more content whenever I'm able to. And have a wonderful evening and a blessed rest of the week.